With rare exception, all of those denominations have used or continue to use the identical statement of Articles of Faith and Practice, which was adopted in 1925 by the Church of Christ. Hence, that document is in the appendix of the current edition of Divergent Paths. The Church of Christ Temple Lot finally renounced all of Fedding's messages in 1936. There are two denominations who exist today, believe only the 30 messages recorded by Otto Fedding, both named Church of Christ, both headquartered in Independence, Missouri. One denomination accepts the earliest messages reported by Fedding, the messages recorded by Thomas B. Nairn, and the messages brought by William Macomber. That's the Church of Christ at Zion's Retreat in Shell City, Missouri. There are at least three denominations that accept all of Fedding's reported messages and most of Drave's messages. The Church of Christ with the Elijah Message, established anew in 1929, the Church of Christ with the Elijah Message, and the Church of Christ with the Elijah Message, the Assured Way of the Lord, all of which are headquartered in Independence. Otto Fedding reported that an angelic messenger first visited him in his home in Port Huron, Michigan at 5:30 a.m. on 24 February 1927. Later, he learned that the messenger was John the Baptist. The first 12 messages issued by Fedding were published in the Temple Lot Church periodical. Fedding, as I said earlier, reported a total of 30 visits between 27 and his death in 33. The messages brought to the church were not inspired utterances in the occasional charismatic sense. Fedding reported that the messenger dictated the messages to him, and he was merely transcribing the messenger's words. This was a marked departure from Joseph Smith's experience, who explained that God's message had to be studied out in the mind and then put into human words. That was how Joseph Smith understood translation, and apparently informed his understanding of Revelation as well. As much is declared so in the Doctrine and Covenants, section 6, 8, and 9, and demonstrated by Joseph Smith's revisions of both the text of the Book of Mormon and sections of the Doctrine and Covenants. In a sense, the Temple Lot Church departed from its own position, described in its Articles of Faith and Practice, by allowing Fedding to predominate as prophet. The difference between Fedding and those who followed him in reporting messages and the ordinary practice of ecstatic prophetic utterances was that Fedding claimed he was only a scribe. Thus, the words themselves were directly God's words. This seemingly reduced other prophetic utterances to a lesser or secondary category. When the 12th message came in the summer of 1929, Fedding and some others took the meaning of one verse to mean that all who wished to remain members of the church had to be rebaptized. Most, like Fedding and others, had come from Community of Christ on their original baptisms. This was rejected by the main body of the church, and about 1,000 people left and formed their own separate church organization. Thomas Nairn was called to be an apostle after the separation took place in Message 20, April 1930. And he helped to organize several congregations of that church in Europe, Western Canada, and the Western United States. He was in Canada in 1932 when he reported that a heavenly messenger awakened him and told him to go to Independence and seek reconciliation with the Temple Lot Church, which he did. He was received back into full membership, and his priesthood office of elder was restored. He then returned to his home in Denver, Colorado, where he persuaded at least one of Fedding's congregations to reconcile and return to the Temple Lot Church. Wilbur Macomber was a follower of Nairn, and in 1939 he was called as an apostle in a message reported by Nairn. William Draves remained in the Fedding fold even after Fedding's death in 1933. Those who followed Otto Fedding believed him to be a living prophet. The first issue of the church paper, The Voice of Warning, declared in an editorial, "In these last days, God has sent his angel John the Baptist to lead, direct, protect, and prepare a people to enter into their promised land and receive their Savior there. It is easy to believe that the messages of prophets long since dead, it is easy to believe the messages of prophets long since dead, but the living prophet has ever been an astonishment and a subject of ridicule for his day." Fetting died on January 30th, 1933, and 1 week later, on February 5th, Thomas B. Narron, then a faithful and active elder in the Church of Christ Temple lot, reported that John the Baptist visited him and gave him a message. In that message, Narron was told that Fetting had not heeded the commands of God and took the reins in his own hands and did not love his brothers and divided the church. And so he was removed. Narron reported a handful of visits from the messenger between 33 and 36. I've not found any evidence that he proclaimed or published those messages contemporaneously. In any event, there is no evidence that the leaders or members of Church of Christ Temple lot knew about them. They would likely not have been as enthusiastic about Narron's messages as they had originally been about Fetting's. Fetting's earliest messages dealt with building a temple on the church property in Independence, and they declared in 1936 that the messages were unreliable and in the interest of spiritual progress for the church be declared that we consider them to be absolved from any allegiance to those messages. But the continued work on the temple would not conform to any specifications supposedly given by John the Baptist to Otto Fetting. Narron and his congregation in Colorado called on Elmer Long, a former Community of Christ member who was an apostle now in the Temple Lot Church, to meet with them in the fall of 36, following the repudiation of Fetting's messages. Long had resigned his apostleship immediately following that meeting, but he helped Narron's congregation determine the future course of action. Several meetings were held and a declaration of faith and purpose was drafted and adopted. And Narron subsequently reported a total of about 100 visits by John the Baptist between 1933 and the early 1940s. The messages were published in the Church of paper, the Aramat, and distributed in a 3-volume booklet form. By 1946, the church became divided over the issue of gathering to Missouri. Narron's reported message of August 1940 confirmed the bishop's purchase of land at Shell City, Missouri for the building of a place of refuge, and many people moved there. For a time, part of the denomination was under the leadership of Narron at Denver, and in Missouri, Bishop James Hedrick was the leader, some of the apostles who had moved there. Congregations of the church from Cranston, Rhode Island, and Independence, Missouri gathered to Shell City. The congregation at Delavan, Wisconsin became independent in 66. Narron died in 67, and any remaining members of the church at Denver having long since vanished, if indeed there were any, by 1950. An apostle in the church, William Macomber, when Narron refused to go to Missouri, began reporting visits from John the Baptist in 1944. But the momentum in the church and the possibilities for growth seemingly were long past. The church at Shell City, which numbered no more than about 50, was rocked by division in the 1970s. One group eventually repudiated all vestiges of Smith-Rigdon restorationism. Those still faithful to the Fetting, Narron, and Macomber messages are probably no more than 25 or 30, if that. After Otto Fetting's death in 1933, his church continued on, publishing his 30 messages in a booklet titled The Word of the Lord. But in less than a decade, the church became divided. In 1937, a young elder in the church, William Draves, reported that the messenger visited him and gave him what is known now by his followers as Message 31. He reported another 31 messages over the next 5 or 6 years. The leadership and members of the church were not fully convinced of the validity of Draves's reported messages. Several congregations in the southern United States distanced themselves from the main body of the church. By the early 1950s, the southern group had formally coalesced into a separate denomination. By 1943, many members of the church repudiated Draves's reported messages, and those who believed in Draves separated and formed a new organization. The denomination from which both Draves and the southern group separated has dwindled into a few dozen members. Weekly meetings are no longer held at its headquarters in Independence. The church periodical, The Voice of Warning, was published monthly, is now issued occasionally. The so-called Southern Group is formally known as the Church of Christ Restored and maintains headquarters in Independence, Missouri, but most of its members live in Louisiana, Mississippi, those areas. They publish the monthly Gospel Herald and report several hundred members. Both 30 message denominations still believe in the possibility of future visits from the messenger, but they are not worried that the messenger has not come since 1933. William Draves, from his first in 37 to his last in 94, reported 90 messages, and the churches that follow his tradition have had no new messages since then, some 20 or more years past. There have been several divisions in that church. At one time there were 4 or 5. There are now 3 or 4. One member of the church reported messages from John the Baptist, published a booklet of them, but none of those found acceptance. From one perspective, it would seem that although this family of denominations that subscribe to the idea of prophecy not being limited to one person, put a lot of amount of trust or faith and a lot of money publishing the messages being presented by one person, whether Fetting, Narron, Draves, or Macomber, they were prophets in the classical definition, even though members of the church may not have used that designation. The problem that arose is that so much of the various churches' faith was centered on the messages that when the messenger's visits stopped being reported, the role of prophet was seemingly lost. No one in any of the churches has been able to persuasively represent the messenger. The churches have lost momentum. They may also have lost a sense of spiritual power and relevance to their own believers and to others, even though they hope for the charismatic to reemerge in tangible ways. The longer the messenger is absent, the more difficult it seems to be able to attract others who might want to join the church. They all struggle with maintaining the status quo. I think it's clear from the several examples in the history of the Smith-Rigdon movement that prophet is something that is not simply external to the believing community. It's the believers themselves who imbue prophet with meaning and give shape and texture to just what prophet is for them. In that sense, prophet is essential to the faith culture of the movement, without which I think the movement has little or no meaning. Thank you. Buy the book, read more about it.